In a distant future, humans had established colonies across multiple planets, each a thriving outpost in a vast and hostile galaxy. Among the many human officers in the Intergalactic Defense Force, Lieutenant Marcus Dunn was well known for his quick thinking and sharp focus. He had led countless missions, each one more dangerous than the last, and each victory only strengthened his reputation as a reliable leader. But his newest assignment was unlike any he had faced before. The galaxy was on the brink of war, and Marcus's unit had been stationed on a remote planet to act as peacekeepers. The alliance between the humans and other alien species was fragile, and tensions were rising. It was here that Marcus encountered an alien race he had never faced before: the Linthari. The Linthari were an imposing species, known for their strength and advanced technology. Their leader, Lady Xylera, was a commander feared throughout the galaxy. She was as intelligent as she was ruthless, commanding armies with an iron fist. Every decision she made was calculated, and she never showed any weakness. Her people admired her, and her enemies feared her. To be in her presence was to feel the weight of authority in its most intimidating form. Marcus first met Lady Xylera during a high-level meeting to discuss the next phase of the war effort. His unit was assigned to cooperate with her forces, and Marcus was to be the human representative. The room where the meeting was held was dimly lit, with large holographic screens displaying data from all corners of the galaxy. Lady Xylera stood at the front, speaking with calm precision, her voice echoing with authority. "You must understand," she said, her alien features sharp and elegant, "that the enemy we face is unlike anything you have encountered. They will stop at nothing to destroy us. Our only chance at victory is unity. The combined forces of the Linthari and your humans are the only thing that stands between them and total domination." Marcus listened intently, his eyes fixed on her. Despite her stern demeanor, there was something captivating about her. She carried herself with such confidence that it was hard not to be drawn to her presence. Yet, Marcus kept his focus, reminding himself that he was there as a soldier, not a fan. As Lady Xylera continued, Marcus noticed a strange feeling creeping up on him, something he couldn't quite place. He admired her strength, yes, but there was something about her that felt familiar, almost human. Perhaps it was the vulnerability hidden beneath her cold, authoritative mask. Everyone in the room fell silent, staring at him in shock. Lady Xylera, in particular, froze. Her eyes, sharp and calculating moments ago, widened slightly as she looked at him. For a split second, no one moved. Marcus stood there, feeling his face flush with embarrassment. What had he just said? He had meant to compliment her on her leadership, on her resolve. But now he realized how his words must have sounded, completely out of place and inappropriate, for the gravity of the situation. Lady Xylera didn't respond immediately. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked as though she was struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Her hand, which had been poised to adjust the holographic display, faltered and fell to her side. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to show that she was no longer the powerful, unshakable leader that everyone had expected her to be. Marcus, sensing the awkwardness of the moment, quickly tried to backpedal. I didn't mean it like that. But his words failed him as he saw the blank expression on her face. The room was still. The Linthari soldiers who had been standing at attention suddenly seemed to shift uncomfortably, as if they weren't sure how to react. Marcus glanced around, realizing that this was not the situation for jokes or misplaced compliments. He had made a mistake, and it was a mistake that had completely thrown off the woman he had only just begun to understand. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he would be reprimanded or dismissed from the meeting. But then, to his surprise, Lady Xylera spoke, her voice soft and slow, though still filled with authority. "Lieutenant Dunn," she began, her tone much more subdued than before, You have a strange way of communicating." There was no anger in her voice, just an unspoken curiosity. It was the first time Marcus had heard her speak with anything other than complete control, and though he couldn't understand why, he felt an odd sense of relief. The room remained quiet, and Marcus was left to stew in his own discomfort. He had no idea how the meeting would proceed now. What could he possibly say to make this situation less awkward? But Lady Xylara didn't give him time to continue fumbling for words. She nodded, once again taking her position as the leader of the room. "We will continue with the discussions," she said firmly. "But perhaps, Lieutenant, next time you will refrain from unnecessary comments." Her words were no longer cold or unapproachable. Instead, there was something almost human about them. Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on it, but for the first time, he saw a crack in her armor. It was a small moment, but it left him with more questions than answers. The meeting resumed, and though the air was still thick with tension, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He had no idea what it was, but he knew that Lady Xylara was no longer just an enemy leader in his eyes. She was something else entirely, and the journey to uncover what that might be had only just begun. The days after the meeting were filled with tension. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The image of Lady Xylara standing frozen, her usual composure shattered, played over and over in his mind. He had never seen her vulnerable before. Her reaction to his spontaneous comment had left a lingering unease, and Marcus found himself questioning everything he knew about the alien leader. The next few days were filled with missions and meetings, but Marcus couldn't focus on any of it. His thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. He had been impulsive, yes, but he never imagined it would have such an impact. The last thing he wanted was to make things awkward between them. But that moment of silence had clearly rattled both her and him. At night, when he lay in his bunk, he would replay the scene over and over. Her eyes wide with surprise, her lips slightly parted, as though she were about to speak but couldn't find the words. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The formidable commander was humanized in that instant, and it shook he. He had no idea what to say. "I'm sorry if I offended you," he replied quickly, hoping his words would smooth things over. "I didn't mean to make things awkward." To his surprise, Lady Xylara shook her head. "No, it's not that. It's just—" She paused, her gaze drifting to the floor for a moment. "You caught me off guard. I've always prided myself on my control, my strength. But you—" She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You made me forget that for a moment." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected such an admission from her. "I didn't mean to disrupt your focus," he said, his voice low. Why did you say that?" she interrupted, her curiosity evident. "You've fought beside me. You've seen what I'm capable of. Why would you call me sweet?" Her question left him at a loss for words. How could he explain something that didn't make sense to him either? "I don't know," he admitted. "It just slipped out. I guess. I just thought you deserved to hear something that wasn't about battle plans or tactics for once. You're more than just a leader, Lady Xylara." The words were simple, but they seemed to hang in, the air between them, heavier than anything he had said before. He could see the flicker of something in her eyes, a mix of surprise and something else he couldn't quite place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, and Marcus felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Finally, Lady Xylara exhaled slowly, her posture softening just slightly. "I never thought a human would see me that way," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I've always been taught that emotion is a weakness, that it clouds judgment. But you don't seem to think that." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't an expert in alien cultures, but he could tell that Lady Xylara had never allowed herself to be seen as anything but a powerful commander. She had lived her entire life with that armor, and he had just made a crack in it, even if it was a small one. "You don't have to be just a commander," Marcus said, feeling a strange sense of protectiveness rising within him. "You're allowed to be more than that." Her eyes softened, just a little. But before he could say anything more, she turned away, her expression hardening once again. "Enough of this," she said firmly, the walls around her going back up. "We have a war to fight. Don't let this distraction interfere with your duty." It was clear that Lady Xylera wasn't ready to fully address what had just happened. She had acknowledged it, but only in the briefest way. Marcus understood. She was not someone who let her emotions rule her. She had learned long ago that vulnerability could lead to failure, and failure was not something she could afford. The rest of the meeting continued, but Marcus couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. He realized that his feelings toward Lady Xylera had changed. He saw something in her that wasn't just the cold, calculating commander everyone feared. There was a person behind that. Armor, someone who, just like him, was fighting for survival in a galaxy that seemed determined to tear everything apart. And as they continued to fight side by side, Marcus couldn't help but wonder, would Lady Xylera ever allow herself to be more than just a commander? Would she ever let him in, even just a little? He didn't have the answers, but he was determined to find out. The war was far from over, and with each passing day, the tension between the human and alien forces grew thicker. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his unexpected comment to Lady Xylera had set something in motion that neither of them fully understood. They continued to fight side by side, but now there was an unspoken connection between them, one that neither was willing to address outright. It was as if they were both testing the waters, afraid to dive too deep, yet unable to ignore the growing pull. The next few weeks were filled with missions that required more than just strategy. They demanded trust. Marcus found himself working closely with Lady Xylera more than ever before. Despite her cold exterior, he could sense a shift in her behavior toward him. She was no longer as dismissive as she had been in the beginning. There were moments when their eyes would meet, and for a fraction of a second, the usual walls between them would disappear. During one mission, Marcus found himself with Lady Xylera on the front lines of a battle. The enemy forces had launched an attack on a key human colony, and their combined forces were the last line of defense. The battle was intense, with blaster fire filling the air and explosions shaking the ground beneath their feet. But through all the chaos, Marcus noticed something strange. Lady Xylera was at ease, moving with a confidence and grace that seemed almost effortless. It was clear that she was a natural leader, but there was something else, something in the way she commanded her troops that caught Marcus off guard. They were surrounded, and the situation was growing desperate. The enemy was pushing harder than ever before, but Lady Xylera didn't flinch. She gave orders with unwavering certainty, her voice calm amidst the chaos. It was a stark contrast to Marcus's own anxious thoughts, but he admired her composure. There was something about the way she operated that made him feel like they could actually win this war. For a moment, the thought of victory seemed possible. "Move your men to the eastern flank," she called out to Marcus, her voice sharp and commanding. "I'll take the north. We'll trap them in the middle." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had worked with commanders before, but none like her. Xylera's ability to remain calm under pressure was something he could never match. Still, there was something about her that made him want to try. He trusted her completely, something he couldn't say for most of his superiors. As the battle raged on, Marcus fought his way through the now she would react. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, was still too great for him. To breach! "We did it together," Marcus finally said, his voice steady. He couldn't deny that it felt good to fight beside her, to work together toward a common goal. Lady Xylara looked at him for a moment, her gaze softer than it had been before. For just a second, he saw something that resembled gratitude in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by her usual mask of control. "Your forces were critical in this victory, Marcus," she said, the tone of her voice shifting back to something more professional. "We may have different ways of fighting, but today we fought as allies." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a spark of something. He had always respected Xylara, but now he found himself admiring her in a way that went beyond her leadership skills. There was something about her, something more than just the fierce commander, that made him want to know her better. Later, as the two of them stood on the edge of the battlefield, watching the remnants of the enemy forces retreating into the distance, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their alliance was growing into something more. They had begun as strangers, working together out of necessity, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them. What they had built on the battlefield was something that could change the course of the war. The war raged on. Every day brought new challenges. But with each passing battle, the alliance between the human forces and the Linthari seemed stronger. Marcus had never expected to find himself working so closely with an alien race, let alone a leader as enigmatic as Lady Xylara. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to understand that this alliance was not just about strategy and tactics. There was something deeper at play, something that neither of them could deny. The mission that brought them even closer together came unexpectedly. An ancient enemy, one long thought to be defeated, had reappeared on the horizon. The Xyrathians, a savage race known for their brutal tactics and relentless attacks, had begun to resurface. They were as dangerous as they were unpredictable, and they posed a threat not just to humans, but to every race in the galaxy. The only way to stop them was to unite the forces of every species in the galaxy. But that was easier said than done. Marcus found himself once again by Lady Xylara's side as they prepared for the most crucial battle yet. The Xyrathians had attacked a strategic planet in the neutral zone, one that neither humans nor Linthari could afford to lose. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the pressure on both of them was immense. As they briefed their troops, there was no time for doubts or second-guessing. The alliance they had formed was the only hope they had of winning this war. "I trust you, Marcus," Lady Xylara said as they walked together toward the command center. It was the first time she had spoken those words directly to him, and they caught him off guard. The confidence in her voice wasn't just a formality. She meant it. They had fought side by side long enough for her to recognize his value, and for Marcus, hearing those words from her felt like an achievement he had never expected. "You've earned it," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. "We've both done our part." Lady Xylara nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that resembled uncertainty. For the first time, Marcus saw her as more than just the unshakable commander. There was a human side to her, one that had been hidden beneath her layers of discipline and duty. He knew that she was just as affected by the outcome of this war as he was, and the thought that she could feel that kind of vulnerability made him feel less alone in his own fears. The battle began at dawn. The Xyrathian forces were heavily entrenched, their ships littering the sky like vultures waiting for the kill. Marcus and Lady Xylara stood together on the command bridge, watching as their forces prepared to launch the first wave. It was a delicate balance, and one wrong move could lead to disaster. The enemy was ruthless, and their tactics were as unpredictable as they were brutal, but Marcus felt a strange sense of calm standing next to Lady Xylara. Despite everything, he trusted her judgment completely. "Keep the pressure on their eastern flank," Lady Xylara ordered, her voice steady and commanding. "We'll split their forces and hit them from both sides." Marcus could see that her strategy was solid. It was a bold move, one that would require all of their forces to be in perfect sync. The success of the operation depended on them working as one, human and alien forces fighting side by side. It was the only way to take down the Zrathians, who would never give up without a brutal fight. The battle was fierce, but as the hours passed, it became clear that the combined forces were starting to turn the tide. The Zrathians were caught, off guard by the united front, and their forces began to crumble under the pressure. Marcus fought alongside Lady Zalara's troops, moving through the chaos with a focus that came only from working with someone he trusted completely. In the middle of the fight, Marcus caught sight of Lady Zalara again. She was directing her soldiers with the same calm precision that had become her trademark. But now, there was something different in her. She wasn't just the cold commander anymore. She was a partner, someone he could rely on as much as she relied on him. Her presence, her leadership, made him feel like they could actually win this war. The battle reached its peak as the Zrathians began to retreat. Their forces, once so overwhelming, were now in disarray. But even as they fled, the danger wasn't over. Marcus and Lady Zalara led the final push, ensuring that the remaining enemy forces were driven from the planet. The air was thick with the sound of weapons fire, but through the chaos, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. They were winning, and in this moment, the alliance between humans and Linthari was not just a strategic partnership, it was a true alliance. As the dust settled, and the last of the Zrathian forces retreated into the distance, Marcus stood beside Lady Zalara, watching their troops celebrate. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Still, for the first time, Marcus felt hope. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Lady Zalara turned to him, her expression serious, but satisfied. "We did it," she said, her voice softer than usual. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, we did." There was a pause, and then he added, "I never thought I'd be saying this, but I'm glad we're on the same side." She looked at him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. Then, with a faint smile, she replied, "So am I, Marcus." It was the closest they had come to acknowledging what had grown between them, and in that moment, he understood that the bond they shared was stronger than either of them had expected. The war was far from over. But for the first time, Marcus felt like he wasn't alone in it. Lady Zalara had become more than just a leader. She was someone he could count on, someone who, despite her cold exterior, was capable of trust and even something more. What the future held, neither of them knew, but for now, they had each other. And that was enough to give them the strength to face whatever came next. The days following their victory over the Zrathians were a strange mix of celebration and preparation. The human and Linthari forces had successfully driven the enemy from the neutral zone, but Marcus knew that this battle, though important, was just one small part of a much larger war. The victory had brought them closer to their goal, but there was still much to be done. Marcus and Lady Zalara found themselves together more often now. Their working relationship had evolved beyond mere necessity. It had become a partnership. As they planned the next phase of the war effort, they continued to exchange ideas and strategies, each learning from the other. The dynamic had changed. There was less formality between them now, and although the lines between military professionalism and personal connection were still blurry, there was no denying that something deeper was beginning to grow. Lady Zalara had always been composed, her presence commanding and unshakable. But Marcus noticed a subtle shift in her behavior. She was still the strong and capable leader, but she seemed to trust him more, allowing him to offer suggestions and voice his opinions without the usual resistance. It was clear that their alliance had moved beyond just a military necessity. There was mutual respect now, something neither of them had expected when they first began working together. One afternoon, as they stood in the command center overlooking The preparations for their next mission, Marcus couldn't help but notice how different things had become. The air was filled with the usual tension of planning, the hum of energy weapons being tested, and the movement of troops preparing for their next move. Yet, through all of it, there was a quiet understanding between him and Lady Xylara that had not been there before. "You're unusually quiet today," Marcus remarked, glancing over at her. She was standing by the holographic display, her eyes focused on the data, but there was a far-away look in her expression that didn't match the intensity of their current situation. Lady Xylara didn't respond immediately, her eyes still locked on the projections. For a moment, Marcus wondered if she had heard him, but then she turned her head slightly and spoke in a tone that was softer than usual. "I'm thinking about everything," she said, her voice low. "The battles, the alliances, the future. I didn't expect things to change this much." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by her admission. Lady Xylara had always been a woman of few words, especially when it came to her personal feelings. To hear her express such vulnerability was rare, and it made him realize how much she had opened up to him over time. "You're not the only one," Marcus said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "When this started, I never imagined that we'd be working so closely together. But now I can't picture fighting this war without you." She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a slight softness in her eyes. It wasn't much, just a flicker of something human, but it was enough to make Marcus pause. He wasn't sure if she fully realized it yet, but something was changing between them. Something that went beyond strategy and tactics. Lady Xylara's lips parted as if she were about to say something, but stopped herself. Instead, she gave a small nod and turned back to the display, her posture returning to its usual rigid form. "We have work to do," she said, the return of her professional tone signaling the end of their brief moment of vulnerability. Marcus didn't push further. He knew she had her walls, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to break them down completely. Still, there was something about the way she had looked at him that made him think that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to let go of the distance between them. As the days passed, their interactions continued to evolve. They no longer felt like strangers thrown together by circumstance. They had become something more, partners in a war that seemed to have no end in sight. Their shared victories and moments of quiet understanding brought them closer, and Marcus found himself thinking about her more than he ever expected. But it wasn't just her leadership that drew him in. There was something deeper in the way she carried herself, in the way she fought, in the way she trusted him when it mattered most. One evening, after a long day of planning and strategy, Marcus found himself walking not just for us, but for everyone we're fighting for. The galaxy can't stay in chaos forever. There has to be a way forward. We can't just keep fighting. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the meaning behind his words. "And what would you suggest?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted. "But maybe we start with the alliances we've made. Maybe we build something new. Something that lasts." For a moment, there was silence between them, and Marcus wasn't sure what Lady Xylara was thinking. He had no idea how she would react to his suggestion. But then, after a long pause, she spoke. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said, her voice quiet, almost contemplative. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. This war has taken everything from me." "I know," Marcus replied gently. "But sometimes the hardest battles are the ones that come after the war ends. We have to be ready for that." The war had changed them both. It wasn't just the constant fighting, the loss, or the endless strategic decisions that weighed heavily on their shoulders. It was something more, something that neither Marcus nor Lady Xylara could ignore anymore. The bond they had formed, born out of necessity and tempered by battle, had become something deeper, something neither of them had been prepared for. The day after their latest victory, Marcus found himself staring out at the stars from the observation deck of the ship. The vastness of space stretched before him, an endless sea of black and twinkling lights. He had always loved the quiet of the night, the stillness that allowed him to think. But today, there was no peace in the silence, the weight of everything. That had happened, and everything that might come next pressed down on him. He thought about Lady Zallara, about how much she had changed in the time they had spent together. She was no longer the unshakable commander he had first met. In fact, she wasn't even the same person she had been when the war began. She had softened, not in her resolve, but in her trust in him. She had allowed him to see sides of her that no one else had ever seen. And in return, he had shared parts of himself with her that he had kept hidden for years. But there was still something he didn't know about her, something she had yet to reveal. Marcus had noticed the guarded way she spoke, the brief moments when her eyes would flicker with uncertainty. It wasn't weakness, he knew that. It was something else, something she wasn't ready to share. And as much as Marcus wanted to understand it, he knew that it was something only she could choose to reveal. The door to the observation deck slid open, and Marcus turned to see Lady Zallara entering. Her expression was as unreadable as ever, but there was something different about her today. Her usual controlled demeanor seemed more fragile, like a piece of glass on the verge of shattering. She walked toward him, her boots clicking softly against the metal floor. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, her voice steady but quiet. Marcus smiled slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I needed to think. Too much going on. Lately." She nodded, her gaze lingering on the stars outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was an unspoken tension, one that neither could fully ignore. Finally, Lady Zallara spoke again. "Marcus, there's something I need to tell you." Her words were unexpected, and they caught him off guard. He turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, but there was a trace of vulnerability there, something she had never shown before. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something from my past, something I've been hiding." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. Lady Zallara, the leader of the Linthari, someone who had always seemed untouchable, was admitting to Kay, keeping something from him. He wasn't sure what to say, so he simply nodded, encouraging her to continue. "You've seen the way I lead," she said, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. "The way I never show weakness. It's not just because of the war. It's because of what happened to me before all of this." She looked at him then, her eyes intense. "Before I became a commander." Marcus stayed silent, waiting for her to explain. "There were incidents," she continued, her voice faltering. "Things I've done. Things I've seen. I never wanted anyone to know. But I've come to realize that maybe you deserve to understand." He took a step closer, his expression serious. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready." But Lady Zallara shook her head. "No, I need to. I can't keep carrying this alone." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, Marcus saw the raw emotion in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. She was no longer just a commander, a leader. She was a person, someone who had been through unimaginable pain. "I was part of a mission years ago," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We were sent to eliminate a faction of rebels on my home planet. They had been causing chaos, killing innocent people. But when we arrived, we discovered that they weren't the enemies we thought they were. They were just people trying to survive. We were told to eliminate them, no questions asked. Marcus's stomach twisted as he listened. He could tell this was something she had never shared with anyone. "We followed orders," Lady Xylara continued, her voice barely audible. "We killed them. All of them. Men, women, children. It was only after the mission was over that I realized we had killed innocent people. It wasn't just a war. It was murder." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. He couldn't imagine the weight of such an experience, the guilt that must have haunted her all these years. "I couldn't live with myself after that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I buried it. I buried everything. I became the commander you see now, the one who never shows weakness, who never lets anyone get close. I thought if I kept everyone at arm's length, I could forget what I had done. But it doesn't work like that." Marcus didn't know what to say. He could see the anguish in her eyes, the pain that she had carried alone for so long. He didn't have any answers for her, no words that could take away the burden she felt. But he did know one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. "You're not that person anymore, Xylara," he said gently, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You've changed. I've seen it. You don't have to carry this by yourself. Not anymore." Lady Xylara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on her lips. It was faint, but it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. For not turning away, Marcus didn't say anything. Instead, he stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, offering her the comfort she had never allowed herself to seek. And in that moment, he understood that the bond they shared wasn't just about fighting a war. It was about healing, about finding peace in a universe that had torn them both apart. The war was finally drawing to a close. After countless battles, losses, and sacrifices, the final push to defeat the Xrathians had succeeded. Marcus stood on the deck of the command ship, staring out at the stars, his mind replaying the long journey that had led them here. They had faced insurmountable odds, but against all expectations, they had come out on top. The alliance between humans and Linthari had held strong, and now it was time to build something new, a future beyond the war. But as much as victory felt like a relief, there was still uncertainty in the air. The galaxy was a vast place, and there were still so many challenges ahead. Marcus knew that the end of the war was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require just as much effort, if not more. He glanced to his side, where Lady Xylara stood quietly, her eyes on the same stars, lost in thought. For weeks, she had been more introspective than usual. The weight of the war, and the secrets she had shared with him, had taken its toll. Marcus had seen the change in her. Her vulnerability was no longer hidden behind a mask of command. She had allowed herself to trust him, and in return he had opened up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone else. Their connection had grown beyond military strategy. There was something more between them, something that neither could ignore. "I never thought we'd make it this far," Marcus said quietly, breaking the silence. "When this all started, I didn't know if we would survive, let alone win." Lady Xylara turned to look at him, her face softening. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But we did it. Together." He nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "Yeah, together." The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was filled with the unspoken understanding that had developed between them. Neither of them was the same person they had been when the war started. The constant fighting, the pain, and the loss had shaped them into something stronger. And in the midst of all the destruction, they had found something worth fighting for. "We've both changed, haven't we?" Lady Xylara said, almost to herself. "I'm not sure if I'm the same person who started this war. I used to think that winning was everything, that it was the only thing that mattered. But now I wonder if there's more to it than that. Marcus stepped closer to her, his voice gentle. There is more. There's rebuilding, healing, and a future worth fighting for. The war's over, but what we do now matters just as much. The alliances we've forged, the connections we've made, they can change everything. Lady Zylara looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady. For the first time in a long while, there was no hardness in her eyes. There was only the reflection of the person she had become. A leader, yes, but also someone who had found something beyond war. "Do you really think we can make a difference?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "I think we already have," Marcus replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "We've already changed the course of the war, and now we can change the future. Together." The words hung in the air between them, a promise of something new, something worth striving for. It wasn't just about rebuilding the galaxy or securing peace. It was about them, about what they could create together in a world that had been torn apart by conflict. Lady Zylara's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. But then she closed her mouth again, as if unsure of how to express what was in her heart. Marcus could see the struggle within her, the fear of vulnerability, the hesitation that still lingered despite everything they had shared. But he didn't push her. Instead, he simply stood by her, offering her the space to find her own way. "You've always been strong, Zylara," he said softly. "But you don't have to carry everything on your own anymore. You don't have to be the unbreakable commander all the time. You've got me." She turned to him then, her eyes searching his face. For a long moment there was silence, but this time it wasn't filled with uncertainty. It was filled with understanding. Understanding that they didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to know exactly what the future would look like. All they needed was each other. Lady Zylara took a step closer, and for the first time she reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his. It was a simple gesture, but it held more weight than anything they had said in words. It was a promise that they would face whatever came next, side by side. "We'll make it work," she said quietly, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Marcus smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. Yeah, together. And in that moment, as they stood side by side, looking out at the stars that had witnessed their journey, Marcus realized that the future wasn't something they needed to fear. They had already won the hardest battle, finding each other, trusting each other, and choosing to fight for something greater than themselves. Together they could build a future, not just for themselves, but for the galaxy that had been shattered by war.